Trauma nightmares. So today I'm going to talk about how traumatic nightmares typically progress in someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder. And from that, we're going to see something very interesting about the psyche as it relates to story. As I've said in many other videos, before we had psychologists, psychotherapists, and psychiatrists, we had storytellers. And there's a very good reason for this. Now, here's how it typically goes. After someone has one or more severe traumas, very frequently if they have traumatic nightmares, which most people do, they will have verbatim repeats of the trauma. You'll see it happen exactly as it played out in the person's life. Then it'll go from there to a slightly different change in the dream content. If, say, you have a patient who, or person that you know, who was attacked somewhere. I saw this a lot when I was working with veterans, and when I was in active duty military as well. If they were attacked in Iraq, say, they would have verbatim repeats of the attack in their dreams. But then after a certain amount of time, they would start having similar attacks, but it would be in a different setting. Instead of being attacked in Iraq in exactly the same place they were attacked, it might be a slightly different place in Iraq, or it might be back home. It might be in high school. It might be in Walmart or something like that. Then it goes from you are being attacked in a different setting to you're not being attacked currently, but you're about to be attacked. That'll be a very common theme of dreams as they progress. Another thing that can happen is the lethality of the attack can be downgraded with time. You may go from people shelling the Walmart that you're in to people walking up to you and yelling at you or criticizing you, things like that. Then after a while, it shifts again, and you go from the threat of attack to the threat of something bad happening. And it gets more abstractified, and it gets more vague a lot of times. And when you go from there, eventually, if all goes well, you'll get to what is called integrated trauma. So when a trauma has become integrated within the psyche, you have the situation where every once in a while something may trigger a memory related to the traumatic incident. And so you'll have kind of a brief upsurge in contents related to that, but then it goes away pretty quickly. And that can be either in flashbacks or dreams or even just symptoms in general. PTSD is characterized by having symptoms that are persistent and there all the time. If the trauma is integrated, however, it doesn't mean it goes away necessarily. It means that it doesn't dominate your life anymore. And that's obviously the goal. The goal is not to make the trauma disappear completely, because you can't do that, except in very rare circumstances. So there's a very interesting process going on here. Now, most of this is pretty well known amongst psychotherapists, that as you go from the trauma being recent to having weeks to months go by and watching the dream content shift, what I think it's important to point out here, what I'd like to point out to you is the process that's underlying this. Like, what is the psyche really doing here? Why is it doing it this particular way? Well, if you notice, what's happening initially is that the psyche is very caught up in the trauma. And that makes a lot of sense, because a trauma is a life-threatening situation. Now, we are not exactly talking about moral injury. That's a different issue that has to do with war trauma in particular. Not always, but frequently. That actually is a slightly different thing that we can talk about in a different video. I'm talking more about your classic, my life is being threatened, or someone that I love's life is being threatened, and there's imminent physical danger. Now, when that happens, you have this typical progression through the dream content. So what is the brain trying to do? Well, initially it's focusing on the event that happened. But as you can tell, if we're just repeating the event over and over again, it's like the brain is not quite figured out what to do with it. It's like, this thing really happened. I need to revisit it again and maybe figure out, how can I avoid this? How can I not get traumatized again? Because if your life is threatened, it's going to mobilize all those innate instinctive survival mechanisms. The genome is going to literally shift in terms of epigenetic profile. A slew of new genes are going to be cranked up to 11, and that's going to affect brain structure and new synapses being generated and all this kind of stuff that you can see in neuroimaging. Very fascinating stuff. But bigger picture, just from the subjective point of view, what the psyche is trying to do is make sense of the trauma. Remember, the brain is a meaning-making organ. So what it's trying to do is make sense of the thing that happened. One of the first steps to doing that is saying, okay, I had this horrible thing happen to me, but I'm not real sure how to make sense of it. Well, how do I do that? So I connect it to what else I know. I connect it to my past. I connect it to what I'm doing right now, maybe going to the grocery store. I connect it to things that happened to me in the past with people I haven't talked to in a while, and so you'll see that sometimes. Or I'll connect it to an imagined future scenario where I think I might be, tomorrow or a year from now. And so it does all of these sorts of things, which is where you get that second step, where it's the trauma very similar to what you experienced, but in a different setting or with some detail shifted. Then it goes from there to, again, in the ideal case, you can go from there to down modulation of the threat to an imminent threat and connecting it further to other aspects of life as we gradually realize that that trauma isn't an imminent threat to us anymore. And that happens when you connect it to all these other things. Now, as you can see here, I can't just say to myself, well, I'm no longer in danger, and poof, all the symptoms go away. It doesn't work like that, because the brain has multiple layers of consciousness going on at the same time. So the one that we normally experience, the ego consciousness, that's the one that comes up with the story about, oh, I'm fine now, everything's great. That's the easy part of the psyche to convince, because you just look around and you're like, yeah, okay. But that's not the origin of the dream content. So the dream is looking at all these deeper layers of the psyche, and those are more embodied. They're more involved in our physiology, our fight or flight response, the fear centers, all of these instinctive ancient centers of the brain and the body. So those are the ones that have to be convinced for the symptoms to alleviate. And those are not so easy to convince. Okay. So essentially what I'm saying is there is a process that happens after a severe trauma, wherein the brain goes through these mechanisms of trying to heal you from the trauma, i.e., helping you with the symptoms of PTSD, because those are fight or flight symptoms that are no longer needed. And there is this process that naturally occurs in everyone that, if it's unhindered, will lead you to integrated trauma. Now, there are a couple of things that can halt this. This is why sometimes people can have a trauma and 20 years later still be having verbatim repeats of the trauma types of dreams. So if that is the case, it means this process has not been allowed to progress. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. It can be drugs, you can be re-traumatized, it can be all sorts of things. Current stressors, all sorts of stuff. So then, normally what you see is a gradual progression into dreams that are no longer completely dominated with trauma content. Now, here's the thing I want you to notice. How is the psyche healing us? With stories. That's how. It's telling new stories every night when you're dreaming with the spontaneous thought that occurs, and going from I'm attacked to I was attacked, and it does have these ramifications here and there, but I'm okay now. I'm a little bit more on guard. I'm a little bit more on edge sometimes, but that's okay, and I'll be all right. And this process occurs naturally if it's allowed to proceed unhindered. What therapists and medications and everything do is help to facilitate that natural healing process. So we don't do this with our magic therapy skills. What we do is we facilitate you healing yourself. Now, what a major problem can happen here then is when you have essentially a split narrative problem. So this is when your mind says, well, this is my one story that I'm going to stick to. Everything's fine and hunky-dory. But the body knows differently, or thinks differently, if you will. And in that case, you think you're fine, you're telling yourself you're fine, but you're not fine. Your body says, I'm still in danger. I've still got things that could possibly kill me right now. And so you get ongoing fight or flight symptoms: fight, flight, or freeze, or paralyze. Those are the four main defenses. Now, for those of you out there who are listening to this that are storytellers yourself, consider using these ideas in your writing. So this natural healing process, I would encourage you to use these principles in your writing, because what you're doing is contributing to healing, contributing to meaning making in your craft. You may not think that's what you're doing, but there's a really good reason why storytelling is so ancient and why storytelling is so important. It's because this has been the primary way in which we have tried to heal each other throughout the millennia, throughout the countless thousands of years that we've been around, through storytelling. Folk healers of all traditions all over the world use storytelling as a big major part of their craft. So while you may be writing something that you feel like is just a frivolous adventure or whatnot, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. Entertainment is great. But I would encourage you to go a deeper level and say, what might I be trying to heal with my character arc that I'm writing? These principles still apply. And it's one of the main reasons why they become very popular, right? A story can be extremely popular. You might be surprised at how important psyche is to story. That is, the innate way in which we heal is tied to the elements of our favorite stories. This is not a coincidence.